Good day, everyone. This is your captain speaking, and today we will be taking a look at one of the most renowned outlaws of the American Wild West. So pull on your boots and grab your equalizer, boys, because today we're digging into the history of Billy the Kid to discover the man behind the myth. Billy the Kid was born Henry McCarty on either September 17th or November 23rd, 1859, in New York City, New York, to Irish Catholic parents Patrick and Catherine McCarty. The exact date of his birth is disputed, but Reverend James B. Roberts of St. Peter's Church in Manhattan sent a letter to the author Jack DeMattos claiming that the church is in possession of records showing that Billy the Kid was baptized as Patrick Henry McCarty on the 28th of September 1859, making the birth date of September 17th appear far more likely. Billy's father died when he was still young, and his mother moved him and his younger brother Joseph from New York to Indianapolis, Indiana. It was here that Billy's mother met a man named William Henry Harrison Antrim. The McCartys and Antrim moved from Indianapolis to Wichita, Kansas in 1870. They then moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where Catherine McCarty married William Antrim at the First Presbyterian Church on March 1st, 1873, when Billy was 14 years old. He and his brother Joseph acted as witnesses to the ceremony. From Santa Fe, the family then moved to Silver City, New Mexico. Shortly after, in 1874, William abandoned his wife and stepsons. Not long after, Catherine succumbed to tuberculosis, then known as consumption, leaving Billy and Joseph as orphans. At 14 years old, Billy was known to be a very honest and diligent worker, earning room and board at a boarding house for a time, though at 15 he was forced to seek new lodgings. Shortly after this, on September 16, 1875, he was caught stealing food, and then on September 26th, he and a man named George Schaefer robbed a Chinese laundry, stealing clothing and 2 pistols. Captured and charged with theft, Billy would only spend 2 days in jail before escaping and going on the run as a fugitive. An article about this event would be published in the Silver City Herald the following day, marking the first story ever published about Billy the Kid. While on the run, Billy tracked down his stepfather, William Antrim, and stayed with him for a time before being thrown out of the house. Billy stole clothing and guns from his stepfather before leaving. The two would never see each other again. Billy next found himself in the southeast of the Arizona Territory, where he worked as a ranch hand and spent his free time gambling. In 1876, he met and was hired by ranch owner Henry Hooker, who was a personal friend of another well-known Wild West figure, Wyatt Earp, and owned the first and eventually the largest ranch in the Arizona Territory. During his time working for Henry Hooker, Billy met a former U.S. cavalry private named John R. Mackey. The two would proceed to steal horses from the soldiers in the area around Camp Grant, which is now a state prison known as Fort Grant in Graham County, Arizona. At this time, Billy was known as Kid Antrim due to his youth, slender build, and boyish attitude. On the 17th of August, 1877, Billy was in a saloon in the unincorporated community of Bonita in Graham County when Frank Cahill, known locally as Windy Cahill, reportedly called Billy a pimp during an argument, to which Billy responded by calling Cahill a son of a bitch. Cahill attacked Billy, throwing him to the ground and attempted to steal his pistol. In the struggle, Billy managed to shoot Cahill, gravely wounding him. Cahill died a day later. A witness to the shooting is quoted as saying, quote, "He had no choice. He had to use his equalizer," end quote. While the witnesses viewed the killing as justified, the law may have found Billy guilty for murder, as he had shot an unarmed man. Fearing this very outcome, Billy, who had been taken to Camp Grant by the local justice of the peace, a man named Miles Wood, escaped jail and fled back to New Mexico before any real law enforcement could arrive to try him. During his flight back east, Billy was accosted by the Apache, who took his stolen horse and forced him to make the rest of the journey to the nearest settlement on foot. Billy was near death when he arrived at Fort Stanton in the Pecos Valley of Lincoln County, New Mexico. There, he sought out his friend John Jones, who was a member of the Seven Rivers Warriors gang, whose mother nursed him back to health. Once he had regained his strength, Billy went to Apache Tejo, a former Army outpost, and joined a band of cattle rustlers who made their living raiding the herds owned by Lincoln County cattle magnate John Chisholm. It was during this time that he began to go by the alias William H. Bonney. Eventually, Billy made his way into the employ of the English businessman and rancher John Henry Tunstall, working as a cowboy on his ranch. Tunstall and his partner, the lawyer Alexander McSween, were enemies of an alliance consisting of Irish-American businessman Lawrence Murphy, Union Army veteran and businessman James Dolan, and John Riley, the three of whom had a stranglehold on the economic and political operations of Lincoln County, which was bolstered in part by their beef contract with Fort Stanton and a popular dry goods store in the town of Lincoln. In February of 1878, McSween had accrued a debt of $8,000 to James Dolan, who obtained a court order from Lincoln County Sheriff William J. Brady to attach $40,000 worth of Tunstall's land and livestock to the debt. Billy was put in charge of 9 of Tunstall's best horses and tasked with relocating them safely to Tunstall's ranch. At the same time, Sheriff Brady assembled a posse with the intent of forcefully seizing Tunstall's cattle. On the 18th of February, 1878, Tunstall learned of the posse's presence on his land and rode out to intercept them. During the confrontation with Brady and the posse, Tunstall was shot in the chest, causing him to fall from his horse. Another member of the posse then dismounted, took Tunstall's own gun, and shot him in the back of the head, killing him. This murder would be the spark that ignited the Lincoln County War. Billy and fellow cowboy Dick Brewer swore affidavits against Brady and the posse for the killing of Tunstall, and obtained a murder warrant from Lincoln County Justice of the Peace John B. Wilson. On February 20th, Billy and Brewer were arrested by Brady whilst attempting to serve a warrant for his arrest. Deputy U.S. Marshal Robert Widdenman, who was a friend of Billy's, along with a detachment of soldiers, arrested Brady's jail guards and freed Billy and Brewer. Following his release, Billy joined the Lincoln County Regulators. On March 9th, the Regulators captured Frank Baker and William Morton, both of whom were part of the posse that killed Tunstall. Both men were shot dead whilst allegedly trying to escape. On April 1st, the Regulators ambushed Sheriff Brady and his deputies. During the ensuing fight, Brady and Deputy Sheriff George W. Hinman were killed, while Billy the Kid suffered a wound to his thigh. Jose Chavez y Chavez took credit for the killing of Sheriff Brady. 3 days later, on the morning of April 4th, 1878, the Regulators were involved in the now legendary gunfight at Blazer's Mill. Blazer's Mill was located between the town of Lincoln and the town of Tularosa, and was owned by Dr. Joseph H. Blazer, a dentist. The area consisted of a 2-story house, a square office building, a sawmill, a grist mill, several small adobes and houses, a post office, a general store, a saloon, and several corrals and barns. A man by the name of Buckshot Roberts had been implicated in the crimes committed by the Murphy-Dolan faction, and was in Blazer's Mill when the Regulators arrived. Roberts was planning to leave Lincoln County, wanting nothing to do with the brewing war between the Regulators and the Murphy-Dolan faction. He had sold his ranch and was waiting on a check from the buyer. The Regulators, consisting of Dick Brewer, Charlie Baldry, Billy the Kid, Doc Scurlock, Frank McNabb, George Coe, Frank Coe, John Middleton, Jim French, Henry Newton Brown, Fred Waite, Jose Chavez y Chavez, and several others rode into Blazer's mill in search of food. Going to retrieve the check from the buyer of his ranch, Roberts spotted the regulators eating lunch in town. Frank Coe spotted Roberts and attempted to talk him into surrendering peacefully. Fearing that he would be killed if he gave himself over to them, Roberts refused. Impatient with the standoff, Brewer sent Charlie Baldry, Doc Scurlock, Billy the Kid, George Coe, and a number of others to arrest Roberts, who opened fire on them with his Winchester repeater. At the same time, Baldry fired his pistol at Roberts, striking him in the stomach. The shot aimed at Baldry hit his belt buckle, breaking it and knocking the wind out of him, but otherwise leaving him unharmed. Doc Scurlock was grazed by a slug, and another struck George Coe in the hand, severing his trigger finger, while John Middleton was shot in the chest. When the Winchester clicked empty, Billy rushed in to subdue the gravely wounded Roberts, only to be knocked senseless when Roberts hit him with the barrel of his gun. Barricading himself in Dr. Blazer's house, Roberts armed himself with a single-shot Springfield rifle that belonged to the doctor. He then laid himself prone on a mattress in front of the blocked front door of the house and waited. The regulators tended their wounded while calling out to Roberts to give up and come out peacefully, but their request was ignored. Frustrated that none of the regulators were willing to approach the door of the house, Brewer circled around the back, taking cover behind a stack of logs. He then proceeded to open fire on the house. Looking in the direction of the gunfire, Roberts spied a cloud of gun smoke rising from Brewer's shooting position and took aim. When Brewer raised his head to fire again, Roberts shot him once through the eye, killing him instantly. Seeing their leader fall, the regulators withdrew from the area. Roberts died the next day from his wound and was buried out in the yard beside the house. Dick Brewer was buried right beside him. Following the gunfight at Blazer's Mill, Billy and two other members of the regulators were issued warrants for the murders of Brady, Hindman, and Roberts. On July 14th, a Sunday, McSween and the regulators, now numbering in the 50s or 60s, took up positions around the town of Lincoln. Billy the Kid, Florencio Chavez, Jose Chavez y Chavez, Jim French, Harvey Morris, Tom O'Falliard, and Eugenio Salazar took up position at McSween's home, while another group, led by Doc Scurlock and Marin Chavez, stood guard on the roof of the saloon. On Tuesday, the 16th of July, Sheriff George Pepin sent sharpshooters to kill the regulators on the saloon roof, but they retreated when one of the sharpshooters, Charles Crawford, was killed by the regulator Fernando Herrera. At least 5 other sharpshooters were wounded, while the regulators suffered no casualties. Sheriff Pepin then sent a message to Fort Stanton, requesting assistance from the commandant, Colonel Nathan Dudley. The reply from Colonel Dudley informed Pepin of his refusal to intervene. However, he later changed his mind and arrived in Lincoln on the 18th with a contingent of soldiers, turning the tide of the battle in favor of the Murphy-Dolan faction. By the 19th, only the contingent of men at the McSween house were left, all of the other groups having been quickly defeated by the soldiers. That night, the McSween house was set ablaze, and McSween, as well as several others, were shot dead whilst trying to escape the burning structure. The remaining regulators, now under the command of Billy the Kid and Jim French, reorganized and managed to escape. At the end of the battle, at least 5 regulators, including McSween, were dead, whilst the Murphy-Dolan faction had only lost 2 men, the sharpshooter Charlie Crawford and Bob Beckwith, the latter of whom had been the one to kill McSween and was subsequently killed by Billy. On August 5th, Billy and 3 other survivors of the battle were holed up near the Mescalero Indian Agency when Morris Bernstein, a bookkeeper at the agency, was killed. All 4 regulators were indicted for the murder, despite evidence showing that he was killed by Constable Atanasio Martinez. Eventually, all of the indictments, except for Billy's, were dismissed. On October 5th, U.S. Marshal John Sherman informed the newly elected governor and former Union General Lew Wallace that he had a warrant for the arrest of Billy the Kid and numerous others, but was unable to serve them due to the, quote, disturbed condition of affairs in that county resulting from the acts of a desperate class of men, end quote. On November 13th, Governor Wallace issued an amnesty proclamation, pardoning all those who had been involved in the Lincoln County War, save those who had been indicted on further crimes. This meant that Billy the Kid was ineligible for the pardon. On February 18, 1879, Billy and Tom O'Folliard were in Lincoln and forced at gunpoint to witness the murder of Huston Chapman. Chapman was shot dead and his body set on fire. The man holding Billy and Tom at gunpoint was Jesse Evans, another outlaw who had fought on the side of the Murphy-Dolan faction during the Lincoln County War. Billy mentioned Evans in letters he wrote to Governor Wallace. In the letters, Billy admitted that he feared Evans might try to assassinate him. Also in these letters, Billy wrote that he was willing to meet with the governor and provide information on the Chapman murder in exchange for amnesty from the law. On March 15, 1879, Wallace responded to the letter and agreed to meet. Billy and Wallace would meet 2 days later, in Lincoln. During the meeting, Wallace agreed to grant Billy amnesty if he would testify in front of a grand jury. Wallace sent a letter to Billy on the 20th of March, telling him that Sheriff Kimball would arrest him and that Kimball had been instructed to use no violence so that Billy could be safely locked away until he could testify. Billy agreed and was subsequently taken into custody on the 21st. As per the agreement, Billy testified in court as to what he witnessed during the Chapman murder. However, following this, the district attorney refused to set him free. After several more weeks behind bars, Billy began to suspect that Wallace had been duplicitous in their dealings and escaped from jail on June 17, 1879. Billy managed to stay under the radar until January 10, 1780, when he shot and killed a man named Joe Grant at Hargrave's Saloon in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. While the Santa Fe Weekly New Mexican reported that the cause of the altercation was never learned, other accounts report that Billy had been informed that Grant planned to kill him, so Billy approached Grant and expressed admiration for his revolver and asked if he could examine it. Grant agreed and handed it over. Whilst inspecting the pistol, Billy made note that there were only 3 rounds in the cylinder, which he adjusted so that when it was fired next, it would land on an empty chamber. When he returned the pistol to Grant, Grant then pointed the gun at Billy's face, pulling the trigger. When the gun failed to fire, Billy drew his own pistol and shot Grant once in the head, killing him on the spot. The Las Vegas Optic quoted Billy the Kid as saying, "It was a game of 2, and I got there first." Later, in 1880, Billy struck up a friendship with a rancher named Jim Greathouse, who would later introduce him to the outlaw Dave Rudabaugh. On November 29, 1880, Billy, Dave Rudabaugh, and Billy Wilson encountered a posse led by Sheriff's Deputy James Carlisle, who chased them to Greathouse's ranch. Cornered, Billy told the posse that they were holding Greathouse hostage. Deputy Carlisle offered to trade places with Greathouse, and Billy accepted the offer. Carlisle later tried to escape through a window, but was shot 3 times and killed. Following this, the posse withdrew, and Billy, Dave, and Wilson made their escape. A few weeks later, after reuniting with O'Folliard and Charlie Bowdry, Billy and his gang rode into Fort Sumner, unaware that a posse led by the lawman Pat Garrett was laying in wait for them. In the ensuing gunfight, O'Folliard was killed, but the rest of the gang managed to escape unharmed. A bounty for the capture of Billy the Kid was issued by Governor Wallace on December 13, 1880. The bounty offered was $500, which is roughly the equivalent of $15,000 when adjusted for inflation. 10 days later, Bowdry was killed when Pat Garrett's posse laid siege to the gang in Stinking Springs, New Mexico. After the siege, Billy, Rudabaugh, and the others were captured by Garrett's posse and taken to Las Vegas, New Mexico via Fort Sumner. The day after their arrival in Las Vegas, Garrett and his prisoners boarded a train bound for Santa Fe, but were delayed when Deputy Sheriff Romero and an angry mob arrived to demand that Garrett hand over Dave Rudaball, who had shot and killed Deputy Antonio Lino Valdez during an escape attempt several months prior. Garrett refused, and eventually agreed to let the deputy and 2 others accompany them to Santa Fe, where they could petition the governor to have Rudaball given over to them. In an interview about the event, Billy the Kid is quoted as saying, quote, "If I only had my Winchester, I'd lick the whole crowd," end quote. Whilst in jail in Santa Fe, Billy sent 4 letters to Governor Wallace over a span of 3 months. In these letters, he asked the governor to grant him amnesty. Wallace refused. Billy the Kid went to trial in April of 1881 in Mesilla, New Mexico. The trial lasted only 2 days, after which Billy was convicted for the murder of Sheriff Brady, marking the only conviction against any combatant of the Lincoln County War. On April 13th, Judge Warren Bristol sentenced Billy the Kid to hang by the neck until dead, with the date of execution set for May the 13th, 1881. Popular legend says that during the sentencing, the judge told Billy that he was to be hanged by the neck until he was dead, dead, dead. To which Billy replied, "You can go to hell, hell, hell." However, according to the records of the trial, Billy did not utter a single word during or after the reading of his sentence. Billy was returned to Lincoln to await execution. He was held under guard on the top floor of the courthouse. On April 28th, Pat Garrett was in White Oaks, New Mexico, and Deputy Bob Olinger took 5 prisoners across the street to treat them to a meal, leaving Deputy James Bell behind alone to keep an eye on Billy. Billy requested to be taken outside to use the outhouse, and on the way back into the jail, Billy was walking ahead of Bell. On the stairway, Billy jumped ahead and hid around a blind corner and slipped his cuffs. When Bell rounded the corner, Billy used his cuffs to beat Bell, then stole his revolver and shot him dead as the deputy tried to flee. With his legs still shackled, Billy went to Pat Garrett's office and armed himself with a shotgun. Going to the window, Billy waited for Olinger to respond to the gunshot, then called out to him, "Look up, old boy, and see what you get." When Olinger looked up, Billy shot him with the shotgun, killing him. An hour later, Billy managed to free himself from his shackles using an axe. He then stole a horse and fled, reportedly singing loudly as he left Lincoln. With Billy the Kid once more on the loose, Governor Wallace issued a new $500 bounty on his head. 3 months later, on July 14, 1881, Pat Garrett, having heard a rumor that Billy the Kid was spotted near Fort Sumner, rode out from Lincoln with 2 deputies. They went to the house of Pete Maxwell, the son of land baron Lucian Maxwell and a known friend of Billy's. Pat and Maxwell spoke for several hours, and around midnight, the 2 were sitting in Maxwell's darkened bedroom when Billy unexpectedly returned. Unable to recognize the 2 figures, Billy reportedly drew his pistol and called out, "Quien es? Quien es?" which is Spanish for "who is it?" Recognizing Billy's voice, Garrett drew his own gun and fired twice. The first shot struck Billy in the chest, just above his heart, while the second missed entirely. He was 21 years of age at the time of his death. Following his killing of Billy the Kid, Pat Garrett commissioned the journalist Marshall Upson to ghostwrite a book detailing his own account of events. The book is titled The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid and was first published in April of 1882. There have been many legends claiming that Billy the Kid did not die that night. The most prominent being the claim by a man called Brushy Bill Roberts from Hico, Texas, who claimed that he himself was Billy the Kid. Roberts even went so far as to go before New Mexico Governor Thomas J. Mabry and request a pardon. Mabry dismissed Roberts' claim, and Roberts died shortly after on the 27th of December 1950 at the age of 71. Despite having no evidence to support his claims, Hico, Texas opened a Billy the Kid museum to capitalize on Brushy Bill Roberts' legacy. Another man, John Miller of Arizona, also claimed to be Billy the Kid, but his claim was disproven when his teeth and bones were exhumed in 2005, roughly 70 years after his death. DNA samples were sent to a lab in Dallas, Texas, to be compared to blood samples taken from the floorboards of the Lincoln County Courthouse, where Billy's body had been laid after his fatal shooting. The results of the test were ruled useless in a 2015 Washington Post article. In 2004, researchers sought to exhume the body of Billy's mother, Catherine, to compare her DNA to the body buried in Billy the Kid's grave. This never occurred. In 2010, Governor Bill Richardson of New Mexico turned down a request to issue a posthumous pardon to Billy the Kid for the murder of Sheriff Brady during the Lincoln County War. The pardon would have fulfilled Governor Lew Wallace's 1879 promise to Billy, which he never followed through on. Governor Richardson cited historical ambiguity as his reason for dismissing the request. Billy the Kid is buried in Fort Sumner Cemetery in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. A memorial stone for him, Charlie Baldry, and Tom O'Folliard sits at the center of the burial ground with their names and death dates engraved below the word PALS. A new marker for Billy's grave was donated to the cemetery by stonecutter James N. Warner of Salida, Colorado in 1940. The stone was stolen in 1981, but recovered in Huntington Beach, California days later. Governor Bruce King of New Mexico arranged for the county sheriff to personally fly to California and retrieve the stone. The grave was secured inside an iron fence, but in June of 2012, someone broke in and vandalized the grave by knocking the stone over. Billy the Kid has been portrayed many times in film, television, music, comic books, radio dramas, novels, and video games. The first of these was the 1911 silent film Billy the Kid, in which Billy is depicted as a girl pretending to be a boy. This same depiction was also featured in the silent film Billy, also from 1911. In 1958, he was portrayed by actor Paul Newman in the film The Left-Handed Gun. The American country singer-songwriter Chris Christopherson portrayed him in the 1973 film Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, opposite James Coburn as Pat Garrett. Perhaps the most widely known portrayal of Billy the Kid comes from the 1988 film Young Guns and its 1990 sequel, where he's portrayed by Emilio Estevez. Billy the Kid was also portrayed in 1989 by Dan Shore in the film Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, and again in 2019 in the film The Kid by actor Dane DeHaan. The latest depiction of Billy the Kid in film to date comes from the 2021 film Old Henry, where he is portrayed as an old widower with American actor Tim Blake Nelson of Oh Brother Where Art Thou and the Ballad of Buster Scruggs fame as Billy under his birth name Henry McCarty. No matter what view you have of Billy the Kid, I think that he has more than earned his place in the annals of history, and through his many portrayals, his spirit lives on. Thank you all for watching. This has been another episode of Man Behind the Myth. Once again, I have been your host, Captain Crow's Eye. Leave a like and a comment if the mood strikes you, and God's willing, I'll see you all next time. Farewell.